Hi everybody, this is Craig Teener for The Mindful Eye and the photo of the week on the Daily Critique. This week's photo of the week was submitted by Jim, who's an intermediate photographer from the UK. Jim submitted this image as part of the Mindful Eyes community assignment number 8, which was complementary color. Jim says he shot this with a Nikon D80 and at ISO 100 using an effective focal length of somewhere around 110 millimeters. Jim exposed the file at f13 for 1/3 of a second and used a split neutral density filter and a tripod and a remote release. And Jim says the low dawn sun just catching the tops of the wave as it headed toward the East Beach. And I would pronounce where this is in Scotland, but I'll probably just mispronounce it. So somewhere in Scotland, he said just the low dawn light catching this wave was what really caught his eye. And one of the things that I love about this image is that it's a beautiful combination of both the assignment concept. So you've got this real powerful sense of blue and orange as a complementary color pair, which is a real classic in nature, and this is a complementary color pair from the painter's color wheel or mixing color wheel. So you have a combination of this really beautiful color and an incredible moment. Just love what's happening in terms of the way the wave breaks up, not only in terms of value but in terms of color. You get this really cool sort of sense of almost a green that's happening in the middle of the wave where it's starting to curl there, and really beautiful sense of spray coming off the top of the wave with this real dramatic sort of back side light, the real low light that Jim described in the backstory of the image. You have a real beautiful feeling in this image of a repetition of this undulating line that's happening in the image. It's here, it's obviously in the mountains. The sky is really perfect for this. The clouds are framing the mountains in a way where you get another feeling of that quality of line. You see it small in here and in the space shapes, and you see it up in here even though it's subtle, and you see it down here in the water. So really beautiful feeling of repetition just in terms of this real striking quality of line. Something else that I wanted to mention here from a technical standpoint is the fact that Jim, number one, is shooting here at about 1/3 of a second, and I've found that shutter speed range to be really beautiful on surf action. If you're trying to preserve some of the texture and some of the detail, but then increase the shutter speed to simplify. It's really funny. I saw a little bit of a war break out on a blog the other day. It's a place that attracts a lot of negative energy just because the person that runs it is regularly just against tons of things, and of course that creates a reaction in other people. I go there because there's also really beautiful photography there, but somebody decided to take a real easy swipe at the idea of the cliche of photographers using a long shutter speed to blur water. And the idea was that that was unreal. Well, the way the camera photographs water is not at all how we see water. If we freeze the motion, we don't experience moving water like that, and we don't experience it like this either. The reality of a still photograph relative to things are moving is that there's always some form of an abstraction. We can sort of try and approximate what maybe one moment would look like. So I wanted to make that point about the idea of moving water, but more than anything I wanted to make the point that for people who are interested in design and they're actually courageous enough to try and make things where the picture will have to stand on its own, not the kind of scenario where you set yourself on a pedestal that's so high that people can't even talk about your work, then blurring water is so much about simplifying. Moving water, if you don't blur it, is almost always a high contrast subject because you do have areas that are bubbling and they can be next to areas that are in the shade. So you have all these areas of high contrast. If we freeze that quality of line increases the contrast anymore, and it can just overwhelm for the viewer any of the other subjects in the image. And I just love the shutter speed range. I just did a bunch of coastal shooting and shooting surf, and I'm always so much of the time working around 1/3 of a second or 1/2 second, 7/10 of a second. Somewhere in there can just be really nice to get this combination. The other thing that's interesting here is the use of the split neutral density filter. In a shot like this, where a large part of the image, and one of the most important parts, is about motion. To shoot multiple frames and then try and blend them and all that is obviously going to be very difficult. This is a classic example of why I still carry split neutral density filters, and I think they're critically important to the work of landscape photographers, particularly when you're shooting scenic and you're ever going to be shooting in any kind of situation where it's not practical to either keep the camera still or there's a large part of your shot that's moving. So just two technical things that I wanted to mention. I wanted to do one other thing today. I just wanted to talk about a little bit more about the idea of the initial weight of the frame before anything gets added to it, and how we move around before we even start to put subjects in the frame. I've talked quite a bit about this lately. We want to start here and end up here. Top of the frame has more visual weight because of gravity, but this idea of sort of moving like this, very, very powerful. And it's just interesting in this image, you have a pretty flat negative space shape right here, right where we want to start. I think the image is beautiful and it works really well, but this is an image where flipping it creates a different feeling, but it's just interesting to see what happens. In some respects, in my mind's eye, it's a little bit easier to start this image over here when you flip, so that you're starting higher and then working your way down, which is natural. That's the natural movement that we make when we're looking at an image. And now the wave breaking against the natural movement of us moving left to right, in some respects for me, ends up taking on a little bit more power. But I'm really curious to hear Jim's thinking about that, and you're thinking about that. Obviously this is wide enough to be editorial, where somebody could look at it and go, wait a minute, the mountains don't run that way, and it would be backwards. It's just something to think about, particularly in images where you could have the freedom because of the subject matter to flip, and it's not really going to become an editorial distraction to somebody. And then the other interesting thing is that I flipped the mountains and then didn't flip the water, and it's just interesting to see how the implied visual pathway in between things a lot of times has more visual weight than the contouring lines. Here's a contouring line. When I just flip the mountains and these two ideas stack up on top of each other, it really becomes static. And what's really beautiful about Jim's capture, I sort of saved this for last, but one of the things that I love that to me works so well is the fact that these high points of energy are not lined up like this on a vertical. You have to move on diagonals to go back and forth between these areas, and that tends to give a feeling of the image being a lot more dynamic. I'd love to hear your feedback about the things that we talked about today. I want to say a big thank you again to Jim for submitting this image, and a big thank you to all of you who are participating in the assignment area of the Mindful Eyes website. We really appreciate your support. Hope you have a great weekend. Hope to see you again real soon on the Mindful Eye.